Hello, everyone. Welcome to B2B Insiders, definitely the coolest B2B podcast in Brazil. But today we are here with a really special guest. We are here with April Dunford. In our opinion, after our rise and Jack Trout, she is the biggest reference when you talk about positioning and marketing. And yeah.
Hey, so hi everybody. So we're speaking with April. It's such an honor, and April is the author of Obviously Awesome, which is our greatest inspiration when it comes to positioning a solution in B2B. We speak a lot about that on LinkedIn and in our course. And April has worked for companies such as Google and Epic Games. And at the end of 2023, April launched her new book, Sales Pitch, which guides you through the process of selling your product better, right? So in our conversation today, we'll speak about both positioning and sales pitch and how those two parts of marketing and sales process connect. So April, thank you so much for being with us today.
Hey, it's so great to be here. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm April Dunford. I spent the first 25-ish years of my career as a repeat vice president of marketing at a series of venture-backed startups. I think in total I did 7. 6 of those startups were acquired. And so through acquisition, I ended up at a handful of different big companies like IBM and Siebel and Nortel and a handful of others. After I came out of my last company, it was about 8-9 years ago, and I made the switch to consulting. And so now what I do is very narrow. So I only do positioning work. I only work with B2B tech companies. And for the most part, it's B2B tech companies with a complicated enough go-to-market motion that they need a salesperson involved somewhere in selling. And so, yeah, I've written a couple of books, one on positioning and the new one about how to craft a sales pitch. But all of these things kind of come out of the methodology that I'm using with clients to help them get really tight on their positioning and then really tight on the story to sell that positioning.
All right, that's great. And so, can you explain a bit for us? So, the first you did the Obviously Awesome, which is a book about positioning, and now you just recently launched the sales pitch. So, what actually made you go to sales pitch after the positioning? Did you feel like that some of people were either having problems in order to make the next step? And how exactly was the process in order to jump to position to the sales pitch?
Yeah, so I certainly didn't think I was going to end up writing a book about sales pitches. Let me tell you, that was a surprise to me. So the goal of the first book was really to give people a methodology for how to do positioning. So you folks had mentioned Rees and Trout earlier, and they wrote the seminal book on positioning, which is called Positioning: The Battle for Your Mind. And that book did a very good job of describing what positioning is and why we need it and the power of positioning. What it didn't do was give you a methodology for doing it. So for me, as a practicing marketer, I found that very frustrating. My first book, Obviously Awesome, is my attempt to teach people a methodology, as in a step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. Here's how we actually get positioning done. So that was my goal in the first book, and I launched that book, and it was more successful than I expected it to be. I wasn't sure people really wanted another book on positioning, but it turned out they did. In the course of the work that I do as a consultant, however, when I work with a company, we don't just do positioning. We do 2 things. So we do the positioning, and then we take the positioning and we translate it into a sales pitch. That's for a couple of reasons. One is, in my opinion, if you're a B2B company and you have a sales team, the best way to test your positioning is to take the positioning, turn it into a sales pitch, and then let's go try it with some qualified prospects. When I wrote the first book, I thought, well, everybody knows how to make a sales pitch. I don't have to teach you how to make a sales pitch. I'll just teach you how to do the positioning work, and then you can figure out how to make it into a sales pitch. And I'm not going to teach you that part, but I just assumed that people would know how to do that. What I found out, however, after the book came out and through working with a lot of companies, like more than 200, almost 300 companies now, was that the vast majority of B2B companies don't have a sales pitch structure that they particularly like. Everyone's got a sales pitch, but the pitch itself was not actually built with a particular structure in mind. The second thing that I noticed was that almost nobody's sales pitch reflected the positioning that was happening over in marketing. So when we went over to the sales pitch side of things, the sales teams, for the most part, were doing these very feature-oriented product walkthrough kind of, let's just show you all the features and then you figure it out, customer. So that was concerning. And then I knew that if we just did the positioning bit and left the room, even though the positioning was new, the sales team obviously or often didn't understand how to take the positioning and translate it into a new story. So in the work I was doing with clients, I was already walking them through a sales pitch and teaching them how to map the positioning components to a sales pitch structure. So I thought, oh man, maybe I need to write a second book to teach people how to do that, because it's something that I know how to do. I've done it a few hundred times. Maybe it would be a useful thing that have a book out there to teach people how to do that. So that was the thinking behind book number 2, which is sales pitch. So what the book is much like the first book. It's a step-by-step methodology. We're going to build a sales pitch. In my mind, a good sales pitch has 8 sections. Here's how those map to positioning, and here's how to create a compelling story once you have your positioning done that sales and marketing can use to help people understand why pick you over the competitors.
Great. Is the next book is going to be the perfect onboarding?
No.
It goes like into the direction, right? Like the after and after.
No, there's no more books after this, man. I didn't even think there was going to be book number 2. Like book number 3, no way. Like, I'm too old. This is it. I'm done. Everything I know, it's out of my head now. That's it. I'm finished.
No, we need to go through the expansion as well. We need to go through expansion as well. We just start in the beginning of the acquisition. So
that's actually a very good point. I heard someone saying that I don't know where, but the onboarding starts in the actual first touch that you have with a person. That. And that's so interesting, and it just connects with David just said, right? So if you sales pitch, that's the beginning of your onboarding.
I think it's really like one of the things that we do in great positioning is we set the expectation with the prospect about what is this thing all about? What is the value you're going to get out of this thing? And if we do a bad job of doing that at the beginning, it shows up somewhere. So sometimes it shows up in people saying, well, that sounds dumb. I don't even want that. And so they never become a prospect. But sometimes what you'll get is companies that have this positioning that isn't very good, but they happen to have a very good sales team that can sort of, work with it in a way to get a deal closed. But what'll happen is when the customer actually goes to onboard, if the positioning wasn't true or wasn't very good, then the customer goes to onboard the thing and use the thing. And they're like, well, wait a second, this isn't what I thought it was at all. What is going on here? This is not meeting my expectations. And what you'll see is very high churn.
That connects so much with the sales pitch because usually marketing is going to try to reflect the positioning on the website, and because that was built by marketing, right? Yep. But maybe there's a bigger disconnect between the position. So yeah, I guess that's why you wrote the second book.
Well, you kind of bring up an interesting point. Like, here's the thing that I found was really surprising in working with a lot of customers on this, or a lot of companies, is nobody really owns the sales pitch. Like, it's interesting to me. Like, marketing obviously owns the messaging on the website. Sales obviously owns delivering the sales pitch. But there is often this kind of gray area in the middle around, well, who owns actually building the pitch? And what you'll see in companies is they'll be using a pitch that has been around since the year of the flood. Like, and if you ask the sales team, where did this sales pitch come from? They'll be like, oh, I don't know, man. Like, when I started here 5 years ago, we had more or less this pitch, and then we put a new version out and we added a slide, or we took one away. And like, nobody seems to think it's their job to build this sales pitch. Occasionally what'll happen is someone will get mad about this and they'll point at marketing and say, you build this team a sales pitch. And this is generally ends in disaster. And that the marketing team builds a sales pitch, but they don't really know what happens on a sales call. They don't really understand what discovery is all about. They don't really understand what makes a good pitch or a bad pitch because they don't do pitches all day. So they'll build something that sounds good, but it looks a bit more like marketing messaging. They throw it over to the salespeople. The salespeople look at it and go, well, where do I do discovery here? Where do I do objection handling? Where am I actually doing all the things I need to do on a substantive first call? And so they'll either ignore the pitch deck that marketing gives them, or they'll change so much of it that it's unrecognizable. And then everybody's mad.
And it becomes like, it's like a Frankenstein almost, right? Because somebody did this and did that, and it's a mess. So I think one of the things that for me, aside from B2B Insiders, actually my full-time job is at a fraud prevention company called Incognito. It operates out of Palo Alto, and we're early stage. We're on Series A at this moment, and it's interesting that everything connected in the pain for us, at least throughout this whole process. And that's why I wanted to ask, because on the sales process, and we were kind of discovering our positioning based on the pain, because we were listening so much of the pain of the customer throughout the sales process, right? So in your framework on developing positioning, where does the customer pain come up? How important is it when creating the positioning of a solution? And in the end, how does that connect with the sales pitch?
Yeah. So it's interesting when I talk to folks, like often when I go into companies, they will say, well, the pitch should start with the problem that we solve, which is the pain that the customer has. And so I hear that a lot. And the second thing I hear is, well, we need to do discovery to figure out what the customer's pain is, because we won't know until we've asked all these questions and discovered what the customer's pain is. And I disagree with those things a lot. And here's why. So the first thing is, we have a solution. It does not solve any problem. In fact, if we're a startup, it only solves a very, very narrow set of problems or set of customer pains. Now, if we are in the very, very early days, like we just launched the thing and we don't have any customers yet, and we're getting our first bunch of customers, then in that early first wave of customers, we are in fact learning a lot about what customers do and what their pain is, what their situation is, what's happening. However, once we have finished that first wave of customers, we understand what the pain is. We've built this product to solve that pain, and we understand what the customer's problem is. What we don't understand for each new customer is the nuances of it, like what I would call the customer situation. Like, what are they using today? What other things have they tried? Do they have any particular constraints around a solution in this space? This is what we typically do in discovery in sales. So the customer comes in, so that's first thing. Second thing is, well, why wouldn't we just start with the problem? Why wouldn't we come in and say, look, customer, you have this problem. This is how we solve it. The problem with the problem is that the problem is not unique to us as a vendor, right? So if you have direct competitors, they solve the problem too. So what the customer really wants to understand in a sales call is, why pick you over the other alternatives? And so we could talk about the problem. That's great. But that doesn't differentiate us at all. What we really want to get at is, you, the customer, we know you have this problem. We want to understand your situation, but at the same time, we need to educate you on, here's the value we can deliver that no one else can, which is usually a discussion that goes beyond the problem. Usually the discussion goes into, we have a particular point of view on how best to solve that. And because we solve this in a different way from many of our competitors, we can deliver value that no one else can. That is the key story in the sales pitch. It's not, if all we were doing was taking orders, then we could go in and say, oh, look, we're just therapy session. Tell us your problems, and then we'll tell you tick box yes or no whether we solve them. Like, that's not going to win us any deals, because our competitors can go in and do the same thing and they solve all the same problems as we do. I'll give you an example. I used to work in a company where we sold databases, and our pitch at the beginning started with this, hey, you know what the problem is, man? Too much data. There's all kinds of data. It's growing exponentially and you need a way to manage that, right? Like, every database on the planet can solve that problem. There isn't a database anywhere that can solve that problem. But our point of view was that that data was a strategic resource. And that strategic resource needed to play nicely with all the other things you had in the company today and in the future. The value that we could deliver that no one else can was we were the world's most open database system. So we could connect with anything, play nice with anything, and we had the best open system on the market. The other folks who are, in the market we're talking about, they were the cheapest database, or they were the highest performing database, or whatever. Our whole thing was, we're a platform for innovation more than we are a database. And so if what you're really worried about is how are we really going to harness the power of data across the organization, what you want is something that's really, really open. That's kind of the problem behind the problem. And so, I couldn't get there if I just walked in and said to the company, well, what's your problem? They'd say, too much data, man. We got a lot of data. How are we going to manage it? So what I'm doing is I'm going in and I'm doing discovery, like, okay, let's talk about your data. What's important about it? Well, it's important because we got to use it in finance for this, and we got to use it in development for this, and we think we might do some AI stuff with this way. Well, that's really interesting. So do you have data that sits in lots of different databases? Yeah, it does. Well, is it really hard to get that data out of there? Yeah, it is. Have you tried other things to do that? Well, we tried this other database, but it wasn't very open and it didn't play nice with our other things. We've seen that a lot in our customers too. In fact, we think one of the key things is to have a database that's really open and plays nice. So you see what I'm doing there? I'm asking the customer questions. I'm finding out about their situation, but I'm also teaching them something about what makes me different and why they should pick us versus the other guys. I don't know if that makes sense, but that's my long-winded answer.
No, it definitely makes sense. And actually, when I watched your podcast episode with Lenny, and you kind of explained that just in the beginning, and I actually shared with a lot of people, because that's something that we call here when we create content for projects that we're quite involved with. It's like the market context, which is like if your audience does not see your service or your value from the same angle that they're not gonna see how good you are. So this process that you describe as discovery, which is great. It's a really subtle, soft way to identify the pain points, but also to make sure that the prospect is going to look to the market and to their service from the same angle that you are. So it's really good. And this is actually made me think another thing. Like, do you think it's possible to have a good positioning and a bad sales pitch? And besides, and also something related to the position. How can we measure if the position is actually good or not? Because I'll tell you, based on a few examples that you already shared on old podcasts and interviews. Like sometimes I'm like that. There's one in specific which I think it's a Canadian company that's sell robots, and then you identify that the word robot in the pitch made the guys think about like actually old robots, and then you change it that. Do you think that sometimes this kind of aha moments make people try to find their aha moments for them as well, and to make things that could be simple actually a bit more complicated?
Well,
those are a couple of questions. I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a couple of questions. Well, so let me peel off a few. So the first one is how do you know if you've got good positioning or not? This is a good question. Like, I'll tell you, when I was a practicing vice president of marketing and I would get hired in a new company, I would come in and what everybody want me to do is lead generation, like go build the campaigns, April, and get us some leads. And I was afraid to go build campaigns if I wasn't sure that the positioning was tight, because there's no point in building campaigns if the positioning is weak, because everything's going to perform poorly. So I always wanted to go try to do some kind of an assessment. Is the positioning any good or not? And so usually I wouldn't be able to tell that from looking at the numbers, because everything in a company is very specific to that company. I can't look at the conversion rate and tell you, is that good or bad? I can only tell you if it's better or worse than it was last month. So usually I couldn't look at the data and be able to figure that out. What I would do instead is I would listen in on first customer calls, and weak positioning sounds like this. And, the customer gets on, the sales rep is pitching, and the customer's like, I don't get it. What is the backup? Like, what is this thing? I don't really get what it is. You would hear this customer confusion, or there would be this mismatch in comparisons. They'd come on and say, oh, you guys are a CRM. And they're like, no, we're not a CRM. We're something else. Or they'd say, oh, you compete with Oracle. No, we don't compete with Oracle. So if I started hearing this customer confusion or people were comparing us with the wrong things, then I wouldn't know for sure if the positioning was bad, but I could suspect that maybe the positioning could be better. And so then what we would do is we would get a cross-functional team together and we work through this exercise to work on the positioning exactly the way I've described it in the book. At the end of that exercise, we would take the positioning, translate it into a sales pitch, and then we would try it out on some customers. And usually when I did that test, I would do the test with our best salesperson. And after I got the salesperson comfortable with the new pitch and practiced up with the new pitch, basically I'd be going to the best salesperson and saying, does this pitch work better than the old one? And a really good experienced sales rep knows when the pitch is better or worse. And that would be my early indicator that we were making some progress. I couldn't tell you whether or not it's the best possible positioning. There's no way for us to judge that. But I could tell you whether or not it was better than the old one. And then if we did a good job of translating that positioning to a good sales pitch, what we should see immediately is the sales metrics from first call with a qualified prospect to an opportunity should immediately get better, because we're doing a better job of explaining what this thing is, and we should get more prospects turning into opportunities. We should get a better velocity in those deals. We would probably do less discounting. So we'd probably get the average deal size up, things like that. When we actually got the positioning working in the front end, then we should see improvement across the entire pipeline. But in B2B, sometimes that takes a while. If it takes us 6 months to a year to close a deal, we don't often have those metrics right away. So as a marketer, what I would do is I would trust the gut feel of my best salesperson to tell me whether they thought this pitch was working better than the previous pitch. If they thought it did, then we'd say, okay, positioning looks good, let's run with it. If they came and said, nah, I think the old pitch was better, well, then we failed and we got to go back to the drawing board. I don't know if that answers all the questions. I know you had a bunch of questions. So
No, it does. And it's really good, because that's why you need to work on position, because you want to increase your win rates, and other position is about win the market. So that's the goal. My question to you after that one was, like, if you notice that some people sometimes trying to find the great possible positioning, because sometimes the examples that you share with us, it's like they're really cool, like this one, like, oh, that word makes it the whole difference in this process. But sometimes in real life, it's not like that. It's about testing.
No, it's not. Like a lot of times what we have in the workshops that I do, a lot of times the companies come and they're, it's not like they're unsuccessful companies. They're successful companies. They're doing 20, 40, 100 million revenue. And so it would be surprising if we did the workshop and discovered, oh, the positioning's totally wrong. We're going to change it to this completely different thing. Most of the time what we're doing is we're tightening it up. Most of the time we're actually doing two things. One, we're getting the positioning really tight so that it is obvious to the customer what our differentiated value is from the earliest stages of a deal. And the better we can communicate that, the better we can attract the right customers in, have those customers go through the funnel faster, get these customers to revenue faster. Like everything works better if we can do that really tight. I would say 80% of the companies that work with me, it's not that their positioning is bad. It's just a little loose. Like the customers don't really get it. It's taking customers too much work to figure out, why are you different and better? And so all we're trying to do is get really tight on that, put it right in the middle of the story, right in the middle of the messaging. So it's really easy for customers to figure that out. The other thing we're doing in positioning is we're making sure while we're doing this exercise that marketing, sales, product, customer success, everybody is all in alignment around this positioning. So often what we have is the positioning is tight and great in marketing, and then it never survives the jump over to sales. And then you look at what's happening in sales, and we're not positioning anything. We're basically clicking on all the drop-down menus and talking about every feature. So if we can get everybody together in the room and work through positioning, then everybody across the company is going to understand it better. And when we translate that into a sales pitch, the sales team's going to do a better job pitching it because they understand where the positioning came from.
And that's interesting to hear, because I oftentimes think that with all the talk throughout the last maybe 15 years or so around growth, people were so stuck almost only into numbers that I think they value a lot less than they should. The like qualitative feedback from sales. That's something for me that is so invaluable, and it should come first when, for example, you're evaluating the pitch, right? And
yeah,
so,
like if your sales team thinks the pitch is terrible, the pitch is probably terrible.
yeah, exactly.
They are on the front, right?
Yeah.
Here's the thing, though. Here's the other thing you got to take into consideration, though, which is very real. Sometimes you'll get a team, and I've seen this a lot, where the sales team comes and they're like, this pitch is not very good. Like, we have a pitch, it's not very good. We really have to work hard to make people understand what this thing is. We don't think the pitch is working. But when you give them a new pitch that's clearly better, they still don't want to use it. And it's because they're comfortable with the old pitch, even though they complain about it, even though they think it's bad. The new pitches work. Like the new pitches, it's like learning a new conference talk, and they've got the old conference talk, and they know the old pitch. On slide 3, they tell a little joke, and on slide 4, they ask this question. They're very comfortable with the old pitch. So when we go to do the new pitch, we kind of have to, this is what I like about taking the best sales rep and training them first, is we take the best sales rep, we force them to do the pitch a lot and practice on it and practice with us and get comfortable with it. But if that sales rep, after they're comfortable and they've done a bunch of pitches, if they say this is better than the old pitch, well, it's really better than the old pitch because they're comfortable with the old pitch. And the thing has to be really good for people to get out of their comfort zone and adopt something new. And then once I've got the best salespersons all comfortable with it, then I can use that salesperson to help me train everybody else. I can record that salesperson doing the pitch. I can have that salesperson talk to the rest of the team and say, look, you should use this. It's way better. I know. Look at me. I'm the best rep. See these deals in the pipeline? I got these from using that pitch. You guys should use it too. So I think it's really important to have sales involvement in this stuff. If we don't, then we don't have a hope in heck of the positioning actually sticking over in sales.
Yeah. And you usually have at least one salesperson that is excited about marketing and working with marketing. So you should lean on those folks, right?
Yeah, maybe.
At least that's what I try to do.
Like ideally, when you're working on the positioning, ideally the sales executive has to be involved. Like I wouldn't pick anybody who's not in charge. So I think when we're working on positioning, usually what we've got is the vice president of sales or the CRO is in the room. And then we may also invite a couple of sales reps if we think they have a lot of customer experience. But if the vice president of sales doesn't think the new positioning makes sense, they're never going to use it in sales. Yeah. So you have to have the vice president of sales in there, and you got to listen to their feedback when they say, nah, that's not value. We pitch that to customers. They don't care about that. Like sales comes actually with a lot of on the ground expertise about what customers think is valuable and isn't valuable, what's actually differentiated and what isn't. Sales knows better than anyone else who we actually compete with day to day in a deal. And so we need that expertise when we're building positioning. We can't do good positioning without that.
Probably you can share with a few stories. Like that's a bit challenging when you have like this positioning and you need to engage the sales team, because especially when you are working with a team that's a bit more traditional, they've been like on the field for a couple of years, so it's quite difficult to change their mindset and to work in a new way. So I'll ask you if you see like all those AIs sales calls that softwares, if they're really helping in a way, because right now it's quite easier, right? You can actually see how the sales rep goes through the sales call. Like like Gong, all those like softwares that actually translate the whole sales call, and then it can actually say is like, oh, the sales they can get like the feeling about they have like this intelligence.
They can do
AI
a sentiment
intelligence
analysis on whether they think it's going to go good or not, and is the customer positive or not, and they can measure a lot of stuff like who's talking more, and what were the topics that came up. And then you can do this longitudinal stuff where you can study like what sort of issues come up, what sort of objections came up that were common, things like that. I think that's all pretty interesting. Like it's a lot of the stuff that we wish we could get the salespeople to simply track in the CRM, but we know from experience we're never going to get it all tracked to the CRM. So I think that stuff is all super interesting. It's not, I don't think we're going to get great insight into something that changes our positioning in that stuff necessarily, but we should be able to measure things like, how often does a particular competitor come up in a sales conversation? Is there an increase in how often we hear about a competitor in a sales conversation? And therefore, we need to go back to the drawing board and adjust our positioning to account for that competitor, for example. Or same thing with objections. Like, are we starting to hear a new objection that we didn't train the salespeople for? Now it's coming up a lot. So we need to understand that so we can arm the sales team with, here's how we respond when that comes up. So I think there's lots of interesting things like that coming up. But, it's a more efficient, more scalable way to do what we've already been doing in a weekly sales call. Right? Like a weekly call with sales management. Like it's exactly what we're doing in a weekly call with sales management, where we're like, okay, what's going on with these deals? Who are you seeing in the deals? Are you hearing any stuff? And then, so a good sales executive is already doing that. It's just kind of anecdotally. So what we'd be able to do in the future is do that stuff with data and be able to do it automatically.
Yeah, maybe that can be handy and useful in a company with, a huge group of sales executives that you have, the leader in sales, they have to know how they're presenting the pitch. So, but yeah, I wanted to change the gears a bit and go to some of the questions presented by our students, which some of which for me were super interesting. There's one from Raphael. And he asks, what could I do if I developed a positioning and my competitor copied it, and then on top of it, lowered their price?
Your positioning describes how your product is the best in the world at delivering something for a certain set of customers. By definition, if your positioning is good, it is unique and distinct to you and your product's capabilities. Your competitors can't copy it. That's what makes it good. So if your competitor comes and copies it, one of two things are true. Either your positioning was not good in the first place, so what you thought was differentiated value was not differentiated at all. Anyone could say it. Either that, or your competitors are just lying. Now, it's possible your competitors are just lying. That happens. So sometimes you'll come up with this positioning. It's really tight. It's really good. We're the only ones that can do X, Y, Z. We do it amazing. We got a patent. We got a special way of doing it. We're the only ones that can do it. And sometimes you'll get a little competitor that pops up and says, oh, we do that too. And they'll go and tell customers that. And then our job is to simply shine the flashlight on those guys and teach the customer how they're lying. So how we do that in a sales pitch is we come in and say, look, so I'll give you an example. So I have a client of mine, and they offer a solution, and they're the only ones that have a solution for the entire end-to-end life cycle of this particular process. Every other product in the market is, a bunch of piece part products that you have to integrate together. And so the value for my clients is that because they have the whole life cycle together, there's a bunch of good stuff that can happen. One, the life cycle completes way faster because it doesn't have to make the jump from product to product to product. And then two, you have this metadata that scans the entire process. So there's all of this analytics and information you can find out about the process, because all the things, it's just one thing. It's not going from platform to platform to platform. So that's the value. So these guys, they have a competitor, and their competitor says, oh yes, us too. We're a platform, but it's not. It's 5 different products. And so what they do in their sales pitch is they come in and they say, look, there are other vendors on the market that describe themselves as an integrated platform, but they are not. They are individual products. What that means is you are going to have to integrate the individual products together, and there is no way to get this data backplane that you get with us to give you these insights that only we can deliver. If you have another vendor that says they do this, you should ask them these 3 questions, like, show me the report that gives you this, because they cannot do it. And so then what happens is, if that lying competitor is on the short list, like, getting caught in a lie is the fastest way to get eliminated from a deal. So if your competitor is stupid enough to outright lie about something and say it to a customer, that's your lucky day, man. Because all you got to do is teach the customer how to spot the lie, and then they're out. Easy.
That's amazing. Yeah, the difficult part is if you actually build on a positioning that is actually not shining any kind of differentiation about,
then you've done a bad job.
Product.
You've done a bad job on your value propositions. And you see this a lot. Weak positioning often looks like this. Like, it'll say, well, we help you file your invoices faster. So does the competitor. It's like my database example. We help you manage data. Yeah, no kidding. All databases do that. Our database is really scalable. Yeah, ours too, man. Like, none of these things are differentiated. So you got to get to the nut. Really great positioning is getting to the nut of what's the thing you can do that no one else can. Like, why pick you over the other folks? And you got to really get to the center of that. Now, the good news is, if you're in market and you're selling stuff, every day customers are picking you over the other guys for a reason. You just need to figure out what that reason is.
So we have another question from Anna. How do you position a product in such a way as to reinforce the emotional aspects I'm using to build the company's brand?
Yeah. So what was the first one about price?
Yeah, this one we just spoke about.
Oh, it was just what happens if they say the same thing.
They lower the price. Yeah.
Like, we have to sell on value, right? And that's what enables us to charge more. Like, if we all have the same thing, then the only thing to evaluate is price, right? So I just buy the cheaper one. If everything's the same, why we just buy the cheap one? But everything's not the same. The second one about the emotional stuff, I think, is important. There's a really big difference in my mind between B2B consumer when it comes to emotional stuff. So when we are selling products in a consumer situation, we often really tap into a broad spectrum of emotional things. Like, we buy things like makeup and clothes and alcohol and cosmetics. And a lot of these things are sold on a very emotional basis. Like, we're trying to look cool. We're trying to get a date. We're trying to look like we're rich. There's all sorts of things I'm trying to trigger that are like, I'm buying this thing to feel good about myself in whatever way. In business to business, we also have emotions, but it's different in a few critical ways. So one is, in B2B, typically software is not bought by one person. So typically in B2B, it's not, I'm the buyer, I buy just for me. I don't have to consult with anyone else. I don't have to talk to anybody else about it. Usually what you've got is there's a buying group. And so there's the champion of the deal, but they got to make sure that IT is okay with it, and the end users are okay with it, and their boss who's going to actually sign the check is okay with it, and maybe security and legal and purchasing. And so I don't get to go to purchasing and say, look, I just like this one because it's green and I'm feeling green today, man. Like, I don't get to say this. So I have to, even if I'm buying for emotional reasons, I have to have this, I have to make my case for why this is going to be good for the business. So I have to show how it either makes money or saves money or reduces risk. This is all I have. So I do have to make a rational case for buying this thing. Now, the biggest emotion that we have in B2B selling is not a positive one, unfortunately. So the biggest emotion we have to fight in B2B selling is fear. And that is typically fear of making a mistake. So if you think about it, in B2B, whoever the champion is for this deal, that person has really got to stick their neck out to make a recommendation for their boss to buy something. Because if they make a bad choice, bad things happen. Like, they might get passed over for a promotion. They might look stupid in front of their boss. The end users might hate the thing that you picked, and now they hate you. Like it really takes some courage for someone to go and say, I did my research, I did my homework, I picked this one, it's the best one for these reasons, and do that in a way where you feel like, oh, this isn't going to come back on me and be bad. This is why the incumbent leader in a space has such an advantage. Because if you are buying a CRM, you can go to your boss and say, I picked Salesforce because everyone runs on Salesforce. And yeah, it's more expensive, but that's the industry standard. And it's hard to get in trouble for picking that. It's a lot harder to come to your boss and say, oh, I picked this little startup thing. And the boss says, well, why isn't it Salesforce? Well, you better make the case for that. So we need to be very cognizant of how risky a purchase decision typically is. So we need to really think about, how are we taking risk off the table for our champion in the deal? How are we making this decision way less scary for a champion? Now, that's not what people want to hear when they're talking about emotions in selling. They want to be able, most of the time, B2B marketers are like, oh man, that's boring, April. Can't I just sell my thing and say, pick my stuff because it's cooler? And the answer is no, you can't, because that doesn't fly with the boss. You don't get to go to the boss and say, I picked this one because it's cooler. Now, you might, in your heart of hearts, think it's cooler, but you're still going to have to make the case with the other stuff that's actual value. I think the biggest emotional thing we need to really think about is fear. If we're not handling the fear thing, the data on this is terrifying, right? Like, the data tells us that 40 to 60% of B2B purchase processes end in no decision. So half the time, no decision. And then when you scratch at that, it ends in no decision, not because the customer looked at all their options and decided, oh, we'll just stay with the status quo thing because it's better. The majority of the time, they looked at their options Everything kind of looked the same. They couldn't figure out how to make a decision and not have that decision be risky. And so the easiest thing to do is just go to the boss and say, you know what, now's not a good time. Let's not do it this year. Let's make the decision next year or the year after. We lose the vast majority of deals in B2B to that. And so we should be way more worried about that than we should be about, like, how do we make our brand look like liquid death, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's really,
And if I'm
really,
selling consumer stuff, that's different. Then I can get into all the other stuff.
yeah, no, exactly. And that's something
We're
about
the
like
B2B show here. And
everyone
straight
says
talk on the B2B stuff, like, you know, a lot of this emotional stuff it is puny in comparison to the emotional impact of fear of making a mistake.
yeah, it's about trust, right? You need to trust in that thing. So and then people say like, oh, B2B not supposed to be boring. So they just try to copy all the cool stuff that you see on the consumer, but it's totally different because they have different, and that's something really nice that you also shared, because cost cannot be, sometimes it's not an objection, because people pay more if they trust on that solution.
But look at Salesforce. That's the most,
Exactly.
like, generally the leader in a market gets to charge a premium above everybody else because they're the safe choice. They're the easy thing. They can charge way more and people will pay it.
Exactly.
Now, that doesn't mean we want to be vanilla in our marketing. Like, it doesn't mean we don't want to stand out. It doesn't mean that we don't want to have a distinctive brand. I'm just saying, when you start bringing the emotional stuff into it, we need to think about fear first. Solve the fear problem first, and then we worry about all the emotions, other emotions after that.
No, makes sense. Well, we are going to the end of the podcast. April, thank you so much for all like this valuable information that you, and that was awesome. I know that I'm gonna watch that again and again, and also watch a lot of other episodes to reinforce some kind of those things in my mind. Can you share with our audience how they can find more about you? And also, if your book it's already available in Brazil, that's actually a question for me, because I don't know where.
It should be, yeah, it should be. So the two books, obviously Awesome and Sales Pitch, they're both available in Brazil in English only right now, unfortunately.
Okay.
But and that's a paperback book, an ebook, an audiobook. But again, only English at this point. But we're working on translations soon, hopefully. And then I read a newsletter. So if you go to my website, aprildunford.com/books, you can sign up for the newsletter. When you sign up for the newsletter, you'll get a set of templates that you can work through your own positioning. So that's my bait to get you to sign up for my newsletter. If you go to my website again, aprildunford.com, you'll see the podcast there. So I did a series of podcast episodes, about 26 episodes. And each one of those episodes, I'm going really deep on a specific aspect of positioning. So it's just some audio content there. And then the only social media network I'm active on is LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn and follow me there.
Well, that was amazing. Thank you so much, April. The group is just, we have a WhatsApp group, and everybody's just saying, how amazingly clear your answers are, and that's incredible. And but yeah, thank you so much for being with us, and a big thank you for everybody tuning in. Thank you to the insiders who joined us and posed the questions today. Remember to follow B2B Insiders on LinkedIn, and now also on Instagram and TikTok. And besides following me and David on LinkedIn as well, we're both also on Instagram now. So thank you so much, everybody. And thank you so much, April. That was great.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in.